The gun was already in Lane Mercer's hand before he fully understood what he was doing with it. That was the thing about desperation. It didn't announce itself. It didn't give you a moment to reconsider, to sit down somewhere quiet and think through the implications of what you were about to do. It just moved through you like weather, like something that had been building for weeks in the distance and had finally arrived at your location without asking permission. Lane was 31 years old. He had spent the last 41 hours without sleep, which was long enough that the world had taken on a quality he couldn't quite name. Not dreamlike exactly, more like the opposite of dreaming. More like the feeling of something stripped down to pure mechanism, pure function. All the softness burned away and just the hard operating core remaining. His eyes felt like they'd been treated with sandpaper. His mouth tasted like the gas station coffee he'd had 9 hours ago, and nothing since. His left knee ached from where he'd banged it getting into Cal's truck in the dark of the parking lot, and the ache was specific and real in a way that everything else had stopped being. He sat in the passenger seat of Cal Pruitt's 1994 Ford Ranger and looked through the cracked windshield at the lights of Calloway's diner, and he thought about Clara. He was always thinking about Clara. She was 34 years old, his younger sister by 3 years, and she had the kind of laugh that could recalibrate a room, the kind that started somewhere deep and arrived fully formed, no buildup, no warning. Just suddenly there, and suddenly the whole quality of the air around you had shifted. She'd had that laugh their whole lives, through their parents dying when Clara was 19 and Lane was 22, through the years of figuring out how to be a family of two. Through the diagnosis 4 years ago, the word kidney delivered in a small beige office by a doctor with tired eyes who spoke in the careful, measured cadence of someone who has learned that the way you say a thing matters as much as the thing itself. Through all of it, that laugh, still there, still arriving without warning. The dialysis center had called Lane at 8:47 on Tuesday morning. He'd been under a Ford F-150 at the auto shop where he worked 3 days a week, the other 2 days being days the shop didn't need him, which was its own quiet problem. His phone had vibrated against the concrete floor, and he'd slid out from under the truck and looked at the screen and seen the number and felt something drop in his chest before he even answered. The woman on the phone had a professional voice, careful, precise. She said Clara's account was 6 weeks behind. She said the balance outstanding was $4,200. She said that if the account wasn't brought current within 7 days, the center would have no choice but to discharge Clara from the program. Lane had stood in the bay of the auto shop with motor oil on his hands and listened to the woman explain what discharge meant in practical terms. Without the machine 3 times a week, Clara's kidneys could not do what kidneys needed to do. The timeline without dialysis was not a long one. The woman said this gently, the way you say something that is terrible but also simply factual, the way you say a thing when there is no version of it that isn't terrible. Lane had said thank you. He didn't know why. Some reflex of courtesy operating independently of everything else. He'd stood there for a long moment after the call ended, looking at the underside of the F-150 and thinking about Clara's laugh and $4,200 and the distance between those two things, which was a distance he had no honest way of crossing. He'd called Clara after work. He hadn't told her about the call from the center. He'd asked how she was feeling, and she'd said tired, but okay. And she'd told him about a book she was reading, something about birds. She'd been reading a lot about birds lately, and her voice had that quality. It got sometimes in the evenings, softer, a little distant, the quality of a person who has learned to be comfortable with her own company. He'd listened. He'd said goodnight. He'd hung up and sat in his car in the parking lot of the auto shop for 20 minutes. The $4,200 existed nowhere in his life. Not in his checking account, which held enough to cover his share of rent, and not much beyond that. Not in savings, because the category of savings had been theoretical for Lane for the better part of 2 years. Not from his landlord, who had already been patient beyond what Lane deserved and had made clear in the quiet way of landlords that patience had a defined endpoint. Not from the bank, which had said no to the loan application he'd filed 3 weeks earlier in the particular bureaucratic language that managed to be both apologetic and absolute. Nowhere. The money existed nowhere. Cal Pruitt had found him in the parking lot. Cal was 28, 3 years younger than Lane, and he had a face that people trusted instinctively. Open, a little soft around the edges, the kind of face that made strangers give him directions without being asked, and bartenders pour generously. That face had been getting Cal into situations his brain couldn't fully think through for as long as Lane had known him, which was 8 years. They'd met on a job site, worked together for a season, stayed friends in the way of men who have shared physical labor, and the particular intimacy that comes from working alongside someone in all weather for long enough that you know the rhythm of how they move. Cal had listened to Lane in the parking lot. He'd ask questions, specific ones, the kind that suggested he'd been thinking about something for a while. He'd laid out the plan in the direct, unhurried way of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply informing someone else of it. A diner, late Tuesday night, middle of nowhere. One cashier, maybe a trucker or two, asleep over their coffee. In and out in under 20 minutes. Nobody going to be a hero at 1 in the morning over a cash register. Lane had said no. Cal had said he understood. Lane had driven home and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about the machine at the dialysis center, the particular mechanical sound of it that he'd heard every time he'd gone with Clara. A rhythmic, patient, industrial sound, the sound of a piece of equipment doing the work that a human body could not do for itself. He'd thought about what the room would sound like without it. He'd thought about Clara's laugh. He'd called Cal at 11:47. Now it was 1 in the morning on a Wednesday, and the Mojave Desert was doing what it always did in the deep part of the night, which was exist in a silence so complete it had weight to it. And the lights of Calloway's diner burned orange and white against the dark, and Lane Mercer held a revolver in his lap and tried to remember the last time he'd felt like himself. The parking lot was mostly empty. Two semis idling at the far end, their engines a low continuous note against the desert quiet. A Winnebago with a cracked rear window sitting dark near the edge of the lot. And 4 motorcycles lined up near the entrance, big ones chrome, catching the light, parked in a row with the precision of men who take that kind of thing seriously. Lane looked at the motorcycles for about 2 seconds. He should have looked longer. Cal pulled the bandana up over his nose and checked the Mossberg pump action he'd gotten from a pawn shop 3 weeks earlier, when Lane would later understand Cal had already been thinking about this. Cal had been carrying this plan around for weeks, walking alongside Lane's crisis, with his own quieter one running underneath it, and Lane hadn't seen it because he'd been too consumed by the shape of his own emergency to look closely at anyone else's. Lane checked the revolver, a .38 special with a hairline crack along the frame that he'd noticed 2 days ago and had been choosing not to think about since. The cylinder held 3 rounds. He'd been unable to get more on short notice without questions he didn't want to answer. 3 rounds, a cracked frame, 41 hours without sleep. He pulled his own bandana up and looked at himself in the visor mirror. 2 dark eyes above faded cloth. The eyes of a man who had arrived somewhere he'd never intended to be and was still trying to understand the route that had brought him here. He knew the route exactly. That was the worst part. He could trace every turn. They crossed the parking lot. Neither of them said anything. The desert air was cold in the way it got in February, sharp and dry, and Lane's breath came out in small clouds that disappeared immediately. The entrance to the diner was a glass door with a handwritten sign taped to it, advertising the Tuesday special, which was meatloaf and mashed potatoes for $7.99. Lane noticed it because his brain was cataloging irrelevant details the way it does when the rest of it is otherwise occupied with something it can't fully process. He pulled the door open. The smell of Calloway's diner hit him before anything else, burnt coffee and hash browns, and something sweet underneath that might have been pie, or might have been cleaning fluid. The particular compound smell of a roadside diner that exists in every state in the country. The smell of America not quite sleeping, feeding whoever comes through the door at whatever hour they arrive. The fluorescent lights were the particular white of fluorescent lights in places that have never had reason to reconsider their fluorescent lights. The floor was linoleum in a pattern that might have had ambitions once. There were 12 tables, most of them empty, and a counter along the left side with 6 stools, and behind the counter a woman who was in the process of refilling the napkin dispensers when the door opened. She was maybe 53. She had the particular posture of a woman who has spent a significant portion of her adult life on her feet, slightly forward-leaning weight distributed with the efficiency of long practice. Her name tag said Nell. She turned when she heard the door and registered 2 men in bandanas and stopped moving. At a table near the window, a man in a gray suit was slumped over a plate of meatloaf asleep. His mouth was slightly open. His briefcase was on the seat beside him, open, spilling pharmaceutical brochures across the vinyl. His name, though Lane didn't know it yet, was Doyle Ashford, and he had driven 11 hours straight from Phoenix because the alternative was spending another night in a hotel room thinking about his daughter's medical bills. And somewhere around Barstow, his body had simply decided that Table 6 at Calloway's Diner was as reasonable a place as any to stop pretending it wasn't exhausted. And in the back corner, the big round booth, Table 14, the one with cracked vinyl and a table that wobbled slightly on its base. Four men sat with 4 cups of coffee and a shared plate of onion rings that was mostly crumbs. They were large men, not large in the constructed, deliberate way of men who have spent hours in gyms engineering a specific appearance, but large in the way of men whose size is simply the accumulated result of decades of physical existence, the kind of size that speaks of endurance rather than performance, of sustained use rather than design. The oldest of them, the one sitting closest to the wall, had gray at his temples and hands that looked like they had been used as tools for 40 years because they had. He was 56, though Lane couldn't have guessed his age precisely. He had a stillness about him that was not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of a man who has learned over a long time that stillness is its own form of authority, that the person in the room who needs to move least is usually the one in the most control of it. His name was Dax Calloway, and he was in the middle of listening to something the man across from him was saying about a carburetor issue on a 2003 Road King. And he was turning his coffee cup slowly on the table in a small circle, and his expression was the expression of a man who is genuinely interested in carburetor issues on 2003 Road Kings, because he was. Beside him was Reed Halston, 49, with a beard going gray at the edges, and eyes that had a quality Lane would not be able to articulate until much later. The quality of eyes that are always receiving information, always processing, cataloging, filing. Not suspicious exactly, more like professionally attentive, the way certain animals are attentive, the way things that have learned to read environments survive in them. Across the table, Briggs Maddox was 44, compact, with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of training the body to do exactly what you need it to do and nothing else. He'd spent 6 years as a Navy corpsman before the club, and those years had given him an understanding of the human body, its mechanics, its vulnerabilities, its capacity for rapid and decisive change that he carried now as casually as other men carry wallets. And Vance Pruitt, 51, sat with his arms resting on the table and his weight settled and his jaw set in the particular way of a man whose face has learned over time to show less than it holds. He had a scar along his left jaw that he'd had so long he'd stopped being aware of it. His eyes moved constantly, even when the rest of him was motionless, tracking the room by a reflex so old it had stopped registering as a choice. He was noting the entrance, the exit, the position of each person in the space, the sightlines, the distances. He'd been doing this for 20 years in every room he entered, and he would be doing it until he died, and he had long since made peace with that. Vance's eyes moved to the door when it opened. He didn't say anything yet. He watched. The door hit the wall harder than Lane intended. The sound was sharp in the quiet of the diner, and Nell spun around and the man at table 6 stirred but didn't wake, and Vance Pruitt's right hand moved 4 inches toward the edge of the table and then stopped. Lane raised the revolver. Cal raised the Mossberg. Everybody down right now. On the floor. I swear to God. Cal's finger found the trigger and the Mossberg went off, and the blast punched through the ceiling, and plaster rained down in chunks, and Nell screamed and dropped behind the counter, and Doyle Ashford came awake from a dead sleep and found himself looking at a man in a bandana with a shotgun pointed at his chest. His brain still surfacing from 11 hours of driving and the particular depth of exhaustion that produces genuine unconsciousness, simply could not process what it was seeing quickly enough to produce fear. He raised his hands slowly, mechanically, like a man following a procedure he's not sure he's remembering correctly. Lane was already moving because standing still was the most dangerous thing you could do once you'd committed to a thing like this. Motion was cover. Motion was momentum. You moved and you shouted and you filled the room with the fact of yourself so completely that nobody had a second to think, because the second they started thinking, you were finished. On the ground. I said on the ground. Don't look at me. He swept the revolver across the diner. The man at the table, hands up, face white. Nell behind the counter, invisible. The empty booths along the wall. The back corner, Lane's eyes adjusted. The back corner wasn't empty. 4 men. Not on the floor, not diving under the table, not putting their hands up, just sitting there, looking at him with the particular quality of men who have decided what they're going to do and are waiting for the situation to catch up with their decision. Hey! Lane's voice cracked on the single syllable in a way he hated immediately. He steadied it. Get on the floor. All of you. Right now. None of them moved. The one with the gray temples, the one sitting closest to the wall with the coffee cup in his hand, looked at Lane with an expression that Lane could not immediately name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something more like the expression a very experienced man gives a very inexperienced one when he is waiting with patience to see which mistake comes next. The patience was the worst part of it. There was no performance in it, no display, just the genuine article. Son, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who is entirely at ease with the acoustics of difficult rooms. You're going to want to think carefully about what you just walked into. Lane's grip tightened on the revolver. His thumb was hooked over the hammer in the way he'd seen in movies, the way that felt deliberate and controlled, and communicated a specific kind of seriousness. He didn't know yet that this was wrong. He would find out shortly. Shut up, Lane said. Just everybody shut up and nobody gets hurt. Cal was at the register now. He had the Mossberg pressed into the counter beside Nell, who had come back up from behind it because Cal had told her to with a specific urgency that she'd decided not to test. Her hands were on the register keys, and they were shaking badly enough that she kept hitting the wrong buttons and the drawer wouldn't open. Open it. Come on, lady, open it right now. I'm trying. I'm trying, honey, just give me a faster. Open it faster. Lane kept his eyes on booth 14. The four men, none of them moving. Reed Halston, the one with the beard, was watching Lane with an expression of clinical interest. Not frightened, not threatening, just observing the way a doctor watches a patient describe symptoms, gathering information without yet delivering a verdict. Reed leaned slightly toward Dax Calloway and said something. He said it quietly with the particular practiced quietness of men who are accustomed to communicating in environments where they don't want to be overheard. But the diner was very quiet, and Lane was close enough, and he heard it. Frame crack on the cylinder, Reed said. Thumbs over the hammer. He hasn't cocked it. Doesn't know he needs to. The words landed in Lane's chest like something dropped from a height. He hadn't understood all of it, but he'd understood enough. These men had read him the gun, the grip, the gap in his knowledge in the time it had taken him to cross the diner. They'd assessed him the way you assess something you've encountered before and are not surprised by. What did you just say? Lane said. Dax Calloway looked at him. Set the coffee cup down on the table. Slowly. Deliberately. In the way of a man who wants you to notice that he is doing this calmly. That revolver you're holding, he said. Double action. You pull the trigger, it fires itself. But you've got your thumb hooked over the hammer like you're planning to cock it manually. And you haven't. Which means when you squeeze that trigger, the hammer's going to catch on your thumb and the gun is going to misfire. And then whatever happens next is going to go very badly for you. Lane stared at him. I'm not your enemy, Dax said. I'm telling you the truth. That's different. Shut up, Lane said. Just shut up and nobody I know, Dax said, still with that same unperformative patience. You've said that. I heard you the first time. I'm asking you to hear me. Something shifted in the room then. Lane couldn't have described it precisely. It wasn't a sound or a movement, more like a change in pressure, like the feeling before weather. He registered it without understanding it. What happened next happened because Cal Pruitt had been watching the four men at booth 14 not moving and not getting on the floor and not showing the kind of fear that Cal had factored into the plan. And what Cal had decided in the particular way that Cal made decisions was that the situation required escalation. That they needed to take control of the back corner specifically, and the way to do that was to bring the threat closer and make it more immediate. Cal left the register. He walked toward booth 14 with the Mossberg leveled. He stopped at the edge of the table, pressed the barrel down onto the Formica directly in front of Dax Calloway's coffee cup and said, On the ground. All four of you. Right now. Last time I'm asking. Dax Calloway looked at the barrel of the Mossberg. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has seen many times before and has long since stopped being surprised by. The look was not contempt, and it was not bravado. It was simply the look of familiarity. He looked back up at Cal. You ever hunt? Dax asked. Cal blinked. What hunting? Deer elk. Anything like that. What does that have to do with? Because a man who hunts, Dax said, knows something about animals. Specifically, he knows which ones are dangerous when they're cornered, and he learns real fast that you don't corner them if you don't have to. I've got a 12 gauge pointed at your face, Cal said. I know, Dax said. Then why aren't you scared? Dax was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change. Son, he said, I am very, very calm, which is not the same thing as not scared. It means I've been in enough rooms like this one to know exactly what happens next, and I'm giving you the chance right now, this second, to make a different choice. Cal looked at him, and for just a moment, a brief window, a fraction of a second, something moved behind Cal's eyes. Not understanding exactly, but the beginning of it. The first molecule of a thing that might become understanding if it were given time. It wasn't given time. Briggs Maddox's hand came up from under the table. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not dramatic in the way that violence is usually dramatic. There was no shouting. There was no extended struggle. Briggs moved with the absolute concentrated efficiency of a man who has spent years compressing the distance between intention and execution to something approaching zero. His left hand found the barrel of the Mossberg and redirected it, not snatched, not grabbed, but redirected smoothly the way you redirect water upward and to the left, so that when Cal's finger tightened on the trigger by pure reflex, the blast went into the ceiling for the second time that night, and plaster came down in a new location, and the sound was enormous in the enclosed space. His right arm came across the edge of the table. Cal went down hard, face first, and the Mossberg skidded across the linoleum, and Cal Pruitt found himself lying on the floor of a diner in Barstow, with his right arm bent at an angle that arms are not engineered to achieve. And the pain was the kind of pain that occupies the entire available space of a person's experience and leaves no room for anything else. He could not remember how to form words. He made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite screaming, and existed somewhere in the acoustic territory between them. Lane spun. Cal. Vance Pruitt was already moving. Not toward Lane, around him. He came around the side of the booth with the fluid economy of a man who has a clear picture in his head of exactly where he needs to be and is now simply closing the distance to that position. He moved to the space between Lane and the door, not blocking it aggressively, not lunging, just occupying it with the particular weight of a man whose presence in a space changes what that space means. He stopped 3 feet from Lane. Lane had the revolver up. His hand was shaking. He could feel it shaking, and he could not stop it. "Put it down," Vance said. His voice was not raised. It held no theatrical weight, no performance of authority. It was simply the voice of a man saying a thing he means. "I'll shoot," Lane said. "I will. I'll shoot you right now." "I know you will," Vance said, "and you might hit me. But that thumb is going to catch, and you're going to lose half a second, and I've got 3 feet of ground, and I've been awake longer than you think, and it is not going to go the way you need it to go." Lane's chest was heaving. He could hear Cal on the floor, that sound he was making, and it was doing something to him that he hadn't anticipated, some wire pulling tight inside him that had nothing to do with the situation in any tactical sense, and everything to do with the fact that Cal was his friend, had been his friend for 8 years, and the sound was the sound of someone Lane cared about being in pain. And underneath all the adrenaline and the desperate forward momentum of the last hour, he was still just a person who didn't want people he cared about to be in pain. He could hear Nell behind the counter very quietly in a rhythm saying something that he realized after a moment was, "Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy." Like a rosary. Like the words themselves were the only thing keeping something at bay. He could hear the air conditioning kick on, and the papers from Doyle Ashford's briefcase rustle across the linoleum floor, pharmaceutical brochures with stock photo faces, and the sheer mundane ordinariness of those papers on the floor next to this terrified man landed somewhere in Lane's chest like a fist. "This is what you're doing to people," something said inside him. "This is what you're making the room into." And then Dax Calloway's voice from the booth, quiet and level as a line drawn with a carpenter's rule. "It's over, son. The only question left is what kind of over it's going to be." Lane stood with the revolver and the cracked cylinder in the 3 rounds, and Clara's name somewhere in his chest like a coal, and he felt the thing he'd been holding himself together with the forward motion, the adrenaline, the not stopping to think, start to give way, in the way that structural things give way when the stress exceeds what they were built to carry. "My sister," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out the way things do when you've been carrying them too long and something gives way before the conscious mind can intercept it. He stopped. Tried again. "My sister needs," his voice fractured on the word. He held it. "She needs dialysis 3 times a week. And the money." He stopped. Swallowed hard against something closing in his throat. "I didn't know what else to do." Vance didn't move. Didn't use the moment. Didn't step forward into the opening the way a man angling for advantage would have. He just stood there 3 feet away with his hands open at his sides, and he looked at Lane, and what was in his face was something that Lane had not expected to find in any face in this room tonight. "What's her name?" Vance said. Lane stared at him. What your sister? What's her name? The question was so completely outside the architecture of what Lane had been expecting from this moment, from any moment in the last hour, that he stood there for 3 full seconds, with the revolver still up and his mouth slightly open and the world slightly tilted on its axis. Clara, he finally said. Her name is Clara. Vance nodded, slowly, like that mattered, like a name was a thing worth receiving carefully. Clara, he said, and something in the way he said it, not as repetition, not as acknowledgement, but as if he were placing it somewhere specific, making room for it, did something to the temperature of the room. My mother was on dialysis, Vance said. 6 years. Machine 3 times a week, exactly like you said. I drove her to that center every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday for 4 years, before she got too sick for the drive, and we worked something else out. I sat in that waiting room 3 days a week for 4 years, and I know what that room smells like, and I know what watching that process does to a person who loves the one in the chair. The silence in the diner was the kind of silence that has weight. I'm not going to tell you what you did tonight was right, Vance continued, because it wasn't. You already know it wasn't. I can see that you know it, but I understand what it does to a man. When someone you love needs something, and there is no legitimate way to get it, and the days are running out. I understand what that does to your math, what it does to what seems possible. Lane's arm came down, not all the way, an inch, 2 inches. Then help me, Lane said, and his voice saying those 2 words was suddenly young in a way he hadn't been aware of until he heard it. Young and stripped of everything that wasn't fundamental. The voice of someone at the actual bottom of things. Then help me, please, because I don't know what to do anymore, and I don't know who to call, and I ran out of options 2 weeks ago, and I did this because I couldn't think of anything else. So please, help me figure out what to do. Vance looked at him for a long moment. The diner was absolutely quiet. Nell had stopped her rosary. Cal had stopped making the sound. Even the air conditioning seemed to have withdrawn from the room to give the moment whatever space it needed. Yeah, Vance said. His voice was quiet, completely without performance. Okay, let's start with the gun. Lane Mercer looked at the revolver in his hand. He looked at it for a moment that felt longer than it was. The cracked frame, the cylinder with its 3 unfired rounds. This object he'd carried across a parking lot and into a diner and held in his hand for the last 20 minutes as if it were the only thing standing between Clara and whatever came next. He set it on the table. The Formica received it with a small sound. The crack in the frame made a minute noise against the surface. The revolver lay there in the light of the fluorescent fixtures, ordinary and specific, and smaller than the space it had occupied in the last 20 minutes. Lane's hand stayed in the shape of holding something for 3 full seconds after he let go. He looked at it. He looked at Vance. He looked at Dax Calloway in the booth, who had picked up his coffee cup again, the same coffee cup, the same cold coffee, and was regarding Lane over the rim with an expression that contained something Lane had not been offered in a very long time. Not pity, not contempt, not the careful diplomatic neutrality of someone managing a situation. Something that looked against all reasonable expectation, like the beginning of patience. The revolver sat on the table between them like a confession that had finally been made. And the diner was quiet. And outside, the Mojave moved in the dark, the way it always moved, without witness or preference, vast and cold and entirely itself, caring no opinion about what had just happened inside one small lit room on the edge of Interstate 40. Lane Mercer stood in the silence with his empty hand at his side and breathed. The revolver on the table changed the room. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way things change in movies when the moment of resolution arrives with music and a shift in the light. It changed the way pressure changes, gradually, measurably, in a way you feel in your body before your mind catches up with it. The particular tension that had been holding every person in Calloway's diner in a kind of suspended stillness began incrementally to release. Briggs Maddox was already crouching beside Cal Pruitt on the linoleum. Cal was on his side now, having managed to roll from his face with the careful deliberateness of a man discovering the new geography of his own pain. His right arm was held against his body at an angle that communicated clearly that moving it was not something he intended to do voluntarily. His bandana had come down around his chin, and his face was red and wet, and his eyes held the particular expression of a man whose understanding of his own situation has been revised very rapidly and very thoroughly. Briggs examined the arm without asking permission. His hands moved with the impersonal efficiency of someone assessing a mechanical problem. Not unkind, simply professional, the way a man is professional about the things he has spent years learning to do correctly. Dislocated, Briggs said. Not broken. It feels broken. It's not. Cal stared at him. He had the look of a man who is trying to decide whether to be grateful or furious and doesn't have enough information yet to commit to either. Can you fix it? Lane asked. He was still standing beside the table where he'd put the gun down. His legs felt uncertain under him in the way legs feel after adrenaline has been burning through a body for an hour and has now begun to withdraw. Briggs looked up at Lane with the level gaze of a man who finds the question mildly beside the point. I can reduce it, Briggs said. Hurts less if I help. His choice. He looked back down at Cal. Cal's jaw worked. His eyes went to Briggs's hands, which were still, and then to Briggs's face, which offered nothing in the way of persuasion or pressure, just the patient expression of a man willing to wait. Cal's pride and his pain conducted their negotiation in about 4 seconds. Pain won as it usually does when given sufficient evidence to work with. Fine, Cal said. His voice was tight. Do it. Briggs worked quickly. There was a sound from Cal that he would not have been able to make voluntarily, a sound that came from somewhere below the reach of dignity, and then Briggs said done. And Cal sat up on the linoleum and rotated his arm slowly and stopped and rotated it again and looked at Briggs with the expression of a man experiencing something that shouldn't be possible. That's it, Cal said. It barely hurts. Told you, Briggs said, and returned to the booth with the same economy of motion he'd left it with, as if the entire transaction had been a minor interruption to the evening's primary business. Cal sat on the linoleum floor and opened and closed his hand and looked at it like he was verifying that it was still his. Then he looked up at Lane. Something moved across Cal's face. Lane had known Cal Pruitt for 8 years, and he had seen most of the expressions Cal's face was capable of producing, but this one was new. It wasn't gratitude exactly, not yet, and it wasn't shame exactly either, though shame was somewhere in the vicinity. It was something more like the beginning of a reckoning. The first moment of a man starting to measure something he had previously preferred not to measure. Lane, Cal said quietly. What is happening right now? I genuinely don't know, Lane said. Nell Hargrove came around from behind the counter. She moved with the purposeful calm of a woman who has decided that physical action is the only reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances and has identified the specific physical action available to her. She had a coffee pot in her hand. She walked to Lane's table and set a cup in front of the empty chair and filled it. She walked to Doyle Ashford at table 6, who had remained in his seat through the entire sequence of events with the particular paralysis of a man whose body has decided that stillness is the safest available strategy, and she refilled his cup without asking. She walked to where Cal was sitting on the floor, set a cup on the table edge closest to him, and filled it. Cal stared at the cup, then at Nell. Thank you, he said. His voice had something in it that wasn't in it before. Don't thank me, Nell said. I'm not doing it because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I've been on my feet since 3 in the afternoon and my back is killing me, and this is the only thing that makes sense to do with my hands right now. She went back behind the counter. Cal picked up the cup with the arm that Briggs had put back where it belonged. He drank. He said nothing for a moment, and the saying nothing had a different quality than his usual silence, more interior, more like a man who is listening to something happening inside him that he hasn't heard before. Dax Calloway had not moved from the booth. He sat with the same inhabited stillness he'd had since Lane first registered him in the back corner. Not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a man who doesn't need to move because the room is already arranged the way he needs it to be. He set his coffee cup down and looked at Lane. Sit down, he said, not as a command. More the way you say it to someone who has been standing too long and doesn't realize it yet. Lane looked at the chair closest to him. He pulled it out and sat in the simple human act of putting his weight in a chair after an hour of sustained forward motion, broke something open in his chest that he'd been maintaining through pure adrenaline, and he put his face in his hands and breathed. He didn't cry. He came close enough that the difference was technical. Dax watched him without speaking. He gave the moment whatever it needed. First time, Dax said finally. It wasn't a question, but it was open enough to be answered. Lane looked up. Yeah, thought so. Dax said it the way you note a fact about weather observationally without judgment attached. You did everything wrong. You want to know the first thing you did wrong? Not particularly, Lane said. You picked a diner, Dax said. A diner on an interstate at night is a truck stop that serves food. You know who stops at truck stops? People who drive alone for a living, which means they're comfortable with long stretches of silence and isolation, and the specific kind of patience that teaches certain men to be very good at waiting for something to happen. You walk into a diner at 1 in the morning with a weapon. You are not walking into a room full of people who have never encountered an unexpected situation. You're walking into a room full of people who manage unexpected situations for a living. Lane stared at him. You're explaining to me how to rob places better. I'm explaining to you why this was always going to end exactly the way it ended, Dax said. So you understand it wasn't bad luck. Outside, a truck moved through on the interstate, its engine a long, sustained note that rose and fell and was gone. The Mojave going about its business. Dax leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. Why tonight, he said. Specifically. Real answer. You didn't wake up Tuesday morning and decide to do this. Something happened. Lane was quiet for a moment. He was 41 hours past the point where lying required energy he didn't have available. He was sitting in a diner in Barstow at 1:30 in the morning with an empty hand and a cracked revolver on the table, and 4 men who hadn't flinched at a loaded shotgun watching him with a patience that felt less like surveillance and more like something he didn't have a word for yet. He told the truth. The dialysis center called Tuesday morning, Lane said. Clara's account is 6 weeks behind. $4,200. They said if she doesn't clear the balance in 7 days, they're going to discharge her from the program. He stopped. His throat was doing something he didn't have the reserves to fight. Without the machine 3 times a week, he said. She dies. It's not complicated. The machine does what her kidneys can't do anymore, and without it, it's just a matter of time. The diner absorbed this. Doyle Ashford at table 6 had stopped pretending to look at his coffee. He was listening with the expression of a man who had entered the evening expecting one kind of night and had been given an entirely different kind and was still in the process of adjusting. Vance Pruitt, still near the booth, had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, more interior, something working behind his eyes that wasn't the constant environmental scan, but something more specific and more personal. How much, Dax said. Lane looked at him. What? How much does she owe total? Right now. Lane felt the number in his mouth before he said it. It tasted like something that had been sitting in the back of a cabinet for too long. $4,200, he said, and they'll let her keep the machine. $4,200, and she gets to keep being alive. Dax was quiet. Reed Halston, who had barely spoken since the room changed, was looking at the table in front of him, with his jaw set in a way that suggested he was thinking about something specific. We got $273 from the register, Cal said. He said it from the floor flatly without looking at anyone. He'd been counting it while he was grabbing it, and he knew the number, and now the number was just sitting there in the room, and there was nothing to do but say it. I counted it, Cal said. 273. Nobody responded to that directly. The gap between 273 and 4,200 hung in the air of Calloway's diner like smoke from the 2 holes in the ceiling. It was not a gap, it was a chasm. It was the distance between what Lane had been willing to destroy his life for and what Clara actually needed, and standing those 2 numbers next to each other in the same sentence produced a specific quality of despair that Lane felt move through him like cold water. You didn't even get close, Dax said. Not cruelly. No, Lane said. He made a sound that was not a laugh and was not a cry, but occupied the narrow acoustic territory between them. No, we didn't. He put his face back in his hands. The thing about rock bottom, the actual floor of it, the real thing, not the version of it that you imagine when you're still far enough above it to have some perspective, is that it doesn't feel like a dramatic moment. It doesn't feel like a scene. It feels like arithmetic, like a number that is simply and completely and without any available argument wrong, and you are the one who made it wrong. And the wrongness of it is not something you can argue with or explain away or set aside to look at later when you're in a better position to deal with it. It is simply there, and you are simply there with it, and the only thing left is whatever you decide to do next. Lane was at the floor. Hey, Vance said. Lane looked up. Vance had moved from near the booth. He was sitting now in the chair across from Lane, and his elbows were on the table and his hands were loosely clasped, and he was looking at Lane with an expression that was direct and level and contained no pity in it, which was what made it bearable. That feeling you've got right now, Vance said. I know what it is. I've had it. Most people spend their whole lives skirting the edge of it, getting close, backing off, never quite arriving at the actual floor. But you're at the floor tonight, and that matters. Because the floor is something you can push off of. You can't push off of air. Cal was looking at Vance now too from the linoleum with the careful attention of a man who is listening not just with his ears, but with some part of himself that has been closed for a long time and is experimentally, tentatively opening. That is either the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me, Cal said slowly, or I have a significant concussion. Probably both, Briggs said from the booth. Nell made a sound behind the counter. It took Lane a moment to recognize it as a laugh, short, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has been holding herself together for an hour and has just been given the smallest possible aperture of release. And there was a moment, brief as a camera flash gone almost before it registered, where Calloway's diner felt almost ordinary, where the fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee and the scuffed linoleum and the two ragged holes in the ceiling were just a diner, and the people in it were just people in a diner having a conversation that had started badly and arrived somewhere unexpected. Then Dax Calloway reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. I need to make a call, he said. While I do that, Vance is going to sit here with you. You're going to stay where you are. You're not going to do anything I'm going to need to respond to. Who are you calling? Lane asked. Someone who might be able to help, Dax said. He said it simply. No elaboration. Maybe the police, Cal said from the floor. His voice was sharp with a specific kind of fear. Dax looked at him with the patient expression he seemed to have in unlimited supply. If I were calling the police, he said, do you think I'd be announcing it? Cal thought about that for a moment. Fair point, he said. Dax walked to the far end of the diner near the windows that looked out onto the parking lot and the dark of the Mojave beyond it. Lane watched his profile in the glass compose serious speaking quietly into the phone with the unhurried manner of a man conducting a conversation he has had versions of before and knows how to navigate. The call lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a specific and measurable unit of time that feels entirely different depending on what is happening during it. Lane sat at the table and Vance sat across from him, and neither of them spoke much, and Lane was aware of every second of those 4 minutes in a way that he was usually only aware of time when something was counting down. Cal had gotten himself off the floor and into a chair. He was sitting with both hands around the coffee cup Nell had left him, and his eyes were doing something they hadn't done since the truck, actually seeing. Not calculating, not scanning for the next move. Just seeing what was in front of him, taking it in without filter. Lane, Cal said quietly. Yeah, I owe you something. Cal said it carefully, like a man who has identified a specific debt and is not going to pretend it doesn't exist. Lane looked at him. This whole thing, Cal said. The plan, all of it. I came to you with this plan and I told you nobody was going to get hurt and it was going to be simple, and I told you we were doing it for Clara. He stopped. His hands tightened on the cup. That was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Lane waited. I owe money, Cal said, to someone who doesn't wait. I've owed it for 4 months and the situation was becoming... He paused, looking for the right word, and apparently not finding one that was accurate and comfortable at the same time. It was becoming urgent. And when your situation with Clara happened, I saw something that could solve both problems at once, and I packaged it as something I was doing for you because it was easier than telling you what I was actually doing. The room received this quietly. Lane looked at Cal for a long moment. The familiar face, the open, trustworthy face that Lane had known for 8 years, that had always been the face of a man whose instincts were poor and whose intentions were good. He was trying to separate those two things now, and finding that the distance between them felt different than it had before tonight. Who do you owe? Lane said. Cal shook his head. That's not, I'll handle it. Tonight I just needed you to know that I used your situation and I shouldn't have. Whatever happens after this, that's on me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Vance across the table said nothing. He listened to this exchange with the stillness of a man who understands that certain things need to happen without intervention, that the presence of a witness is sometimes all that's needed, and that the witness's job is simply to be there and to see. From the far end of the diner, Dax Calloway ended his call. He stood for a moment with the phone at his side, looking out the window, at the parking lot, at the dark, at whatever a man like Dax Calloway looks at when he is deciding how to proceed. Then he turned and walked back. He stood at the head of Lane's table. His expression had shifted in some way that Lane could register, but not precisely name something had been decided. Some internal process had reached its conclusion, and what remained was the clean, uncomplicated face of a man who has moved past deliberation into action. All right, Dax said. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down. He looked at Lane, then at Cal, then back at Lane. Before I say what I'm going to say, he said, I need you to understand something. Lane nodded. What happened tonight doesn't disappear, Dax said. There is no version of events where it didn't happen. This woman, he nodded toward Nell behind the counter, was frightened. That man, he looked at Doyle Ashford, was frightened. You came into their night with weapons, and you put fear into people who didn't deserve it. And that is real, and it matters, and it doesn't stop mattering because you put the gun down. I know, Lane said. Say it like you know it. Lane met Dax's eyes. I know what I did. I'm not trying to make it acceptable. I know that it isn't. Dax looked at him for 3 long seconds with the measuring quality of a man who has learned to take the accurate measure of things and has learned equally well not to rush the process. Okay, Dax said. Then here's what's going to happen. He laid it out with the direct, unhurried clarity of a man who has thought through what he is offering and has no interest in dressing it up. The money from the register goes back, all of it right now. Lane looked at Cal. Cal reached into the jacket he'd taken off and sat on the chair and produced the canvas bag. He carried it to the counter and set it down in front of Nell without being asked. Nell took it and opened it and counted the bills with the practiced speed of a woman who has handled a cash register for 22 years. 268, she said. 5 short, Reed called from the booth without looking up. Cal's hand went into his jacket pocket and came out with a crumpled $5 bill. He held it up. He had the expression of a man who understands that this moment is not particularly dignified and has decided that dignity is not the currency he's working with tonight. It fell out when I was counting, Cal said. Nell took the 5. She counted again. 273, she said. We're square. Dax nodded. Second condition. Both of you come back tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. You spend the day doing whatever Nell tells you to do to put this place back in the condition you found it. The ceiling gets properly fixed. I'll have someone here within the week at no cost to this establishment. But the work you can do, you do. Without complaint and without attitude. Yes, Lane said immediately. Third, Dax said. He paused in the way of a man arriving at the thing that matters most. You call your sister tonight, before you sleep, and you tell her what happened. Not a version of it. Not the edited account. What happened? Lane's stomach dropped. I know what she'll do, Dax said. That's the point. The truth is the only thing that has any traction. Everything else just delays the weight of it and makes it heavier when it finally lands. Lane was quiet for a moment. And the dialysis, he said. The $4,200. Clara still needs that. Nothing tonight changes that. I know, Dax said. Then I said I made a call. Dax said. I didn't say what came of it. He said it in a way that closed the question for the moment without being unkind about the closing. Some things you learn in the order they happen. That's the order. Lane sat with that. Outside, the interstate carried whatever the interstate carried at 1:30 in the morning on a Wednesday trucks night, drivers, people in transit between one part of their lives and another, the country's blood moving through its veins while most of its people slept. Dax stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his coffee cup, cold now for the second time tonight, and carried it to the counter and set it down in front of Nell. I'm sorry about your evening, he said to her. Nell looked at him with the eyes of a woman who has filed this night away in the specific category of things she will be telling people for the rest of her life. Honey, she said, I'm going to be dining out on this story until they put me in the ground. Dax made a sound that was briefly and genuinely a laugh. Then he nodded to Vance, who nodded back. Reed was already settling his jacket. Briggs stretched his neck with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who sits in booths for extended periods and has learned to manage the consequences. Nell, Dax said. Nell looked at him. There's a motel about a mile east on the frontage road. You know the one. Sunrise Motor Lodge, Nell said. Terry runs the night desk. I'd take it as a favor if you called ahead. Nell looked at Lane, then at Cal. Something moved through her expression, not forgiveness exactly, something more complicated than that. The expression of a woman doing a rapid and accurate assessment of a situation and arriving at a conclusion she intends to act on, regardless of whether it's comfortable. I'll call Terry, she said. Room for two. She paused. Don't smoke inside. Terry hates that. Lane looked at her. Nell, don't, she said, in the tone of a woman who has made her decision and finds further discussion inefficient. You're coming back at 10. You need to sleep somewhere between now and then. She picked up the phone behind the counter. The four men gathered their things with the easy coordination of men who have done many things together over many years and have reduced the communication required to almost nothing. Dax paused at the door. He looked back across the length of the diner. His eyes found Lane's. Call your sister, he said. The door opened. Cold desert air came through for a moment. Then the door closed and the four of them were gone, and Calloway's diner was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before they left. A quieter quiet emptied of something that had been large and present and that Lane already understood he had not fully appreciated while it was in the room. Nell hung up the phone. Room 7, she said. Keys under the mat. Terry's expecting you. Lane sat for a moment without moving. Then he reached for the revolver on the table. Nell watched him without alarm, which was its own kind of statement about how much the geometry of the evening had shifted. He opened the cylinder, removed the 3 rounds, put them in his jacket pocket, set the revolver on the counter in front of Nell. I don't want to carry it out of here, he said. I don't know what you do with it. Nell looked at it. I'll call the county sheriff's office in the morning. Tell them a customer left it. She picked up a cloth and folded it over the gun without touching the grip. Been doing this job 22 years, she said. You learn to handle things. Doyle Ashford had repacked his briefcase with the quiet, methodical focus of a man using task completion as a way of reestablishing order in his experience of the world. He was standing now, coat on briefcase in hand. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the evening and also somehow less tired, as though the particular exhaustion of a man driving away from his problems had been replaced by a different kind of weariness that was at least honest about what it was. He looked at Lane. I have a daughter, Doyle said. 20 years old. She had a cardiac issue last year. The bills. He stopped and cleared his throat. I'm not telling you your situation is the same as mine. I'm telling you I understand the specific mathematics of medical debt, the way it changes what seems possible. Lane looked at him. I'm not going to pretend tonight wasn't terrifying, Doyle said. Because it was. You pointed a weapon at me, and my brain went somewhere I don't want to revisit. He looked at his coffee cup. But I heard what you said about your sister, and I hope it works out for her. That's genuine. Lane didn't know what to say. Thank you felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. He said the thing that was true. I'm sorry I frightened you, Lane said. Specifically, I'm sorry. Doyle nodded once. He left enough money on the table to cover his meal twice over and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the glass. Those men, he said without turning around. The ones who were here tonight. You know who they are, what club they belong to. I know, Lane said. Most people in that situation, Doyle said, would have called the police, or done nothing, or made it worse. He was quiet for a moment. I've been selling pharmaceuticals for 23 years and I've driven this highway twice a month for 8 of them. He pushed the door open. I don't think I understood anything about this stretch of road until tonight. The door closed. Nell watched it close. He always overtips, she said. Good man. Lane and Cal walked out into the cold of the Mojave at 1:40 in the morning and stood in the parking lot and breathed. The parking lot was empty now except for Cal's truck and the 2 distant semis still idling at the far end and the Winnebago sitting dark and still. The 4 motorcycles were gone. Of course they were gone. Lane stood for a moment looking at the space where they'd been. The asphalt where they'd sat was just asphalt again, indistinguishable from the rest of the lot. They didn't even say goodbye, Cal said. They don't seem like the goodbye type, Lane said. Cal was quiet. He was looking at the empty space where the bikes had been with the expression of a man trying to fix something in his memory to hold onto the specific outline of something he suspects he's going to need to recall later. Lane, he said. Yeah, I'm sorry for tonight, for all of it, for bringing you into something and not telling you what it actually was. Cal's voice had the flat, stripped quality of a man speaking without the performance of contrition, without the architecture of apology that exists to make the person apologizing feel better about what they did. Just the thing itself. I told myself it was for Clara, and it was partly for Clara, but it was mostly for me, and you deserved to know that before you decided to say yes. Lane looked at him, the familiar face in the parking lot light. Who do you owe? Lane said. Cal shook his head. I'll figure it out. Tonight I just Cal. Lane said his name plainly, the way you say a name when you mean the person to hear the full weight of it. Cal looked at him. Tell me who you owe, Lane said quietly. Cal told him. It didn't take long. The outline of it, the debt, the source, the 4 months of accumulated pressure in both the financial and physical sense of that word. When he was done, the desert quiet took it and held it with the same indifference it held everything else. Lane nodded slowly. Okay, he said. We'll figure it out. They got in the truck. Cal drove the mile to the Sunrise Motor Lodge in silence. The key was under the mat of room 7, exactly as Nell had said. The room was small and clean and smelled of industrial soap and had a Bible in the nightstand and a painting of a desert sunset on the wall that had probably intended to be inspiring and had arrived at something closer to philosophical. Lane sat on the edge of the bed and took his shoes off and lay down in his clothes and looked at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. Clara's name. She'd texted, "Just checking on you. Couldn't sleep." He stared at the text for a long time. Then he called her. She answered on the second ring, sleep rough and immediately alert in the specific way of people who have learned that late-night calls mean something, who have organized their nervous systems around the anticipation of news. Lane, she said, it's almost 2 in the morning. What happened? He closed his eyes. Clara, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Can you do that? A pause. Short. Yes, Clara said, and Lane Mercer told his sister the truth. He told her about the parking lot and the bandanas and the plan that Cal had brought to him and the specific desperation of a man who has run the numbers in every direction and found no path that works. He told her about the Mossberg and the revolver with the cracked frame and the 3 rounds he'd put in his jacket pocket and was now sitting with on a motel bed. He told her about the diner, the 4 men in the back booth, the phrase, what you just walked into, delivered in a voice that had no anger in it and didn't need any. He told her about Reed Halston reading the gun from across the room, about Cal on the floor, about Vance standing 3 feet away with his hands open asking what's her name. He told her he'd said Clara. He told her he'd put the gun down. He told her about Dax Calloway's conditions, about the phone call, about room 7 at the Sunrise Motor Lodge, about the revolver sitting on Nell Hargrove's counter, waiting for the county sheriff's office in the morning. He told her all of it. When he finished, the phone line between them held a silence that had weight and temperature, and the specific quality of a silence that is not empty, but is very full of things that haven't found their form yet. Clara, he said, you still there? I'm here. Her voice was completely flat. The flatness that is not calm, but is what happens when too many things are happening simultaneously and the signals cancel each other out. I need a second. Take whatever you need. No. Sharp. Don't say that. Don't be gentle with me right now. You don't get to be gentle with me right now, Lane. Okay, you took a gun into a diner. Yes, you pointed it at people. Yes, for me. Her voice fractured on those 2 words. Just slightly, just at the seam. For me, Lane. Clara, don't you dare! Her voice came back fierce, the fracture burned through by something underneath it that was hotter. Don't you dare make this sound like something you did for me. Don't you dare. I never asked you to do this. I never... She stopped, gathered herself. Do you think I would rather have the dialysis money than have my brother in prison? You think that's a trade I would ever make? He didn't answer. There was no answer to that question that wasn't a complete surrender to her position, and he found that he had no argument against surrendering to her position. I thought I was out of options, he said finally. You had my phone number. Clara's voice was fierce and very steady now. That is an option. You call me. You tell me how bad it is. We sit with it together. We figure out what we can figure out, and we face the rest honestly. That is what you do. That is what people do when they have each other. A silence. You are my brother, Clara said. Her voice was doing something complicated, moving through something. You carrying this alone so I don't have to isn't protecting me. It's just you being alone when you didn't have to be. And I would 1,000 times rather be carrying something heavy alongside you than have you disappear trying to carry it for me. Lane pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eye. He was not going to cry. He was not going to do that. The threshold on that particular decision was apparently very close to where he currently was, but it had not been crossed yet, and he was going to maintain that. The man who called, Clara said. The one who might help. Dax Calloway. You believe him. Lane thought about Dax's face, the stillness of it, the absence of anything in it that was performing patience rather than having it. The way he'd said, I made a call without elaboration, without promise, just the statement of a fact. Yeah, Lane said. I believe him. Then here's what you are going to do, Clara said. She had moved into something, some gear that clicked into place when Clara Mercer decided a situation required organization rather than emotion. Lane had heard this gear his whole life, and it was the most reassuring sound he knew. You're going to sleep. You're going to go back to that diner at 10 o'clock. You're going to do exactly what that man said, every single thing without cutting corners. And then you're going to call me and tell me everything that happens. Lane exhaled. And Lane, her voice changed again, went somewhere quieter and more fundamental. Yeah, if you ever, she stopped, if you ever pick up a gun again, for me or for anyone else, I will not speak to you again. I mean that with every part of me. I know you mean it. Good. A breath. I love you. You complete and total idiot. I love you so much. Lane's throat closed. I love you too, he said. Get some sleep. She hung up. Lane set the phone on the nightstand. He lay back on the bed in his clothes, and the ceiling of room 7 stared down at him with the bland indifference of ceilings everywhere. His phone buzzed. Cal's number. 3 words. You good, bro? Lane looked at it. He typed back, getting there. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Same. Hey, Lane. Yeah. Thank you for not running when I told you to back there. Lane read that twice. He set the phone face down on the nightstand. He closed his eyes. Outside, the interstate carried its nighttime traffic trucks and the occasional car people moving through the dark toward whatever was waiting for them on the other side of the Mojave. The engine sounds rose and faded. The desert did its enormous quiet thing on all sides, holding its distances and its silences and the particular quality of darkness that only exists far from city light. Darkness with actual texture to it, darkness you can feel. In room 7 of the Sunrise Motor Lodge Lane, Mercer lay in his clothes on top of the covers and breathed. He thought about Dax Calloway on the shoulder of the interstate somewhere west, riding through that same darkness. He thought about Vance Pruitt saying floor and meaning it in the way that only people who have actually been there can mean it. He thought about Nell calling Terry with whatever favors existed between them. He thought about Clara's voice, fierce and frightened and loving, moving through all those things simultaneously the way Clara always moved through everything fully, without reservation, without holding anything back for later. He did not know what the morning would bring. He knew he was going to find out, and that finding out required him to be rested, and that being rested required him to stop thinking, which was going to be the hardest part. He managed it eventually. Somewhere in the long quiet of the Mojave night, with the desert pressing its silence against the thin walls of room 7, Lane Mercer's body made the executive decision that he had been awake long enough and the rest could wait until morning. For the first time in 3 weeks, he did not dream about money. Lane woke at 7:43. For a moment, he lay still with his eyes open and the ceiling of room 7 above him and no memory of where he was. Then it came back, not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once, the way certain things return, complete sequential, in the order they happened, which was also the order of their weight. The parking lot, the bandanas, the sound of the Mossberg going through the ceiling, 4 men in a back booth who hadn't moved, the revolver on the Formica table, Vance Pruitt's voice asking for a name, Clara. He sat up. His back ached from sleeping in his clothes. His mouth had the particular quality of a mouth that has gone too many hours without attention. His eyes felt raw around the edges. His left knee still had the bruise from the truck door in the parking lot, which felt like it had happened in a different lifetime, which in some meaningful sense it had. He felt more awake than he had in months. He didn't examine that too carefully. He just got up and washed his face with the soap on the sink and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. The red around the eyes, the jaw that needed a razor, the face of a man who had stood at a specific edge the night before and had stepped back from it and who was now going to have to figure out what stepping back meant in practical terms, 1 hour at a time. He called Clara at 7:51. She picked up before the first ring finished. She had been awake. He knew from the quality of her voice the fully present alertness of someone who has been listening for the phone from somewhere just below the surface of sleep, or who had not slept at all. "How are you?" she said. "Sore," Lane said. "Otherwise okay. You slept." "Some." A pause. "Then something happened this morning before you called. The dialysis center called me. Early just after 7. They said my account was under review, that someone from a business office had been in contact about a resolution." She said the word carefully, the way you say a word that has arrived in an unexpected context, and you're not entirely sure yet what to do with it. Lane was quiet. "That was because of Dax Calloway," he said. "Because of the call he made last night." Claire was quiet for a moment on her end. Lane could hear her breathing the specific rhythm of it, the rhythm he had known his whole life. "Who is this man?" she said. Lane thought about how to answer that. He thought about Dax in the booth with the cold coffee turning the cup in a slow circle. He thought about the way Dax had said son without condescension, with the particular weight of a word that means, "I see you, and I am not going to pretend I don't." "Someone who stopped for coffee," Lane said, "and decided to do more than that." Another pause. "Lane," Clara said. Her voice had shifted into the register it used for things that were important and that she needed him to actually hear. "What you did last night, putting that gun down. Don't make it small. I'm not." "You are. I can hear you doing it." Her voice was steady and fierce in the way it got when she was most serious. "That wasn't a small thing. Every version of that night that doesn't end with you putting that gun down ends badly. Ends with you in a cell, or ends with something I can't think about without my chest closing up. You made the right choice when everything in you was pointing toward the wrong one. That matters. It will always matter." Lane looked at the desert sunset painting on the wall of room 7. In the morning light, it looked less tired than it had the night before. Or maybe he was looking at it differently. "I'm going back to the diner at 10, he said. "I've got work to do." "I know," Clara said. "Call me when you're done." He knocked on Cal's door at 9:15. Cal opened it immediately. He was still in yesterday's clothes, but he'd wet his hair down and his eyes were clearer. The eyes of a man who had made a phone call to his mother for an hour and a half and had come out the other side of it, changed in some way that hadn't finished settling yet. "You talked to your mother," Lane said. It wasn't a question. "For an hour and a half," Cal said. "She cried. I cried. She told me 17 things my father would have said if he were still alive. Were any of them useful?" Cal picked up his jacket from the chair by the door. "More than I expected," he said. "My dad used to say that the difference between a mistake and a crime is whether you think it's someone else's problem to clean up." Cal put the jacket on and looked at Lane. "I used to think he was just filling silence. Turns out he was just right." They drove back to Calloway's diner. The morning had done what mornings do to places that held difficult things the night before. It had made everything more accountable. The same parking lot, the same building, the same sign with the Tuesday special still taped to the glass. But in the daylight, the proportions were different, more specific, less dramatic and more real. The busted door frame was just a busted door frame. The 2 holes in the ceiling, visible even from the parking lot through the glass, were just 2 holes in a ceiling. The things that had happened here and could not be undone, and the morning light made no argument against that. Lane and Cal got out of the truck and stood for a moment looking at the building. "I did that," Cal said quietly, "meaning the ceiling, meaning all of it." "We did that," Lane said. Cal was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "We." The door opened before they reached it. Nell Hargrove was already there, dressed in the morning shift's version of what she'd been wearing the night before, the same fundamental posture and the same fundamental competence, wearing a cleaner apron. She had a cup of coffee in each hand, and she held them out as they came through the door with the manner of a woman who has decided that this is simply the next thing that is happening, and she is going to meet it with the same energy she brings to all the things that happen. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep past 8, Lane said. "That's your body telling you it's time to start fixing things," Nell said. She looked them both over with the assessing eye of a woman who has been reading people across a diner counter for 2 decades. "You both look terrible," she concluded. "Thank you," Cal said. "Supply closets in the back," Nell said. "Mop and bucket cleaning supplies, spare bulbs. The light in the back booth has been flickering for going on 2 years, and I'd be grateful if someone looked at it." She paused. "There's a step ladder in there too for the ceiling." Lane looked up at the 2 holes. In the morning light, they looked more final than they had at 1 in the morning. Ragged and specific, the plaster around the edges scorched dark. The marks of what happens when a person makes a bad decision with a loaded weapon inside an enclosed space. I can patch plaster, Lane said. It won't be invisible, but it'll hold until a professional gets here. Good enough for today, Nell said. She went back to the counter. Cal moved toward the supply closet with the focused energy of a man who needs his hands occupied. Lane watched him and thought, that's not guilt driving him. Guilt is static. Guilt sits with itself and turns inward. This is something further along than guilt. This is the feeling of a man who has identified a specific debt and has decided without being asked to begin paying it. They worked. Lane got the stepladder and the plaster compound that Nell produced from somewhere in the back, and he climbed up and worked the 2 holes, methodically packing compound into the ragged gaps with the focused attention of someone who has done this before and knows that the quality of the work depends entirely on the quality of the attention. He'd done construction for 3 years before the auto shop framing drywall finish work. The particular satisfaction of making things structurally sound and then making them look like they've always been that way. He'd been good at it. He'd forgotten that he'd been good at it. Cal mopped. He did it with a thoroughness that exceeded what anyone had asked of him, moving around every table and chair, getting into the corners, doubling back over sections he'd already done when he decided they weren't done enough. The linoleum floor of Calloway's diner had probably not been this clean since the year it was installed. Cal did not appear to notice or care about this. He just kept moving. The back booth light took 20 minutes and a screwdriver. Loose ground wire exactly as old as the booth itself, never properly seated, never failed completely enough for anyone to make it a priority. Lane stood on the stepladder in the back corner of the diner and seated the wire and climbed down, and Nell pressed the switch, and the light came on steady and stayed steady. Nell stood there for a moment looking at it. 23 years, she said, on and off. Every electrician who's looked at it has said it needs a full rewire. Loose ground, Lane said. Common in fixtures this age. Someone just needed to look at it. Nell was quiet for a moment. You do construction, I did. Before the auto shop. Why'd you stop? Lane thought about the real answer. The job that had ended badly, the foreman who had shorted him 2 weeks of pay and known that Lane didn't have the resources to fight it. The cascade of smaller decisions that had each made a certain broken sense at the time and had added up to a situation that made no good sense at all. The kind of story that takes a long time to tell and sounds in the telling a lot like excuses, even when it isn't. Lost my way for a while, he said. Nell nodded. She said it like she understood exactly what that meant, which she probably did, because 22 years behind a diner counter on Interstate 40 was an education in the many ways a person could lose their direction and find it again. The morning breakfast crowd came in around 9:30. Truckers, a family with 2 young kids, a pair of older men in matching caps, who sat at the counter and talked to Nell about something in the low, continuous way of men who have been having the same conversation for 40 years. Ordinary Wednesday morning on an interstate in the Mojave, carrying ordinary people from where they'd been to where they were going. Lane kept his head down and worked. At 10:15, 2 highway patrol officers came in and sat at the counter. They were professional in the way of men whose profession involves constant environmental assessment. They clocked Lane and Cal within 30 seconds of sitting down, noted the stepladder and the compound in the mop bucket, and returned to their coffee with the relaxed alertness of people who have made an initial assessment and are leaving the door open for revision. The older one, maybe 55, broad through the shoulders, finished his first cup and walked over to where Lane was doing a second pass on the ceiling patches. Son, he said. Lane came down off the stepladder and faced him. Morning, officer. The officer looked at the patches, then at Lane, then at the patches again with the specific look of a man connecting things. Those new, yes, sir, what happened to the ceiling? Lane met his eyes. There was an extended moment during which Lane was aware of every variable in the room. Cal across the diner, Nell behind the counter, the second officer on his stool. There was an incident last night, Lane said. We're here fixing it. An incident, the officer said. His voice was neutral, professionally neutral, which was different from actually neutral. I'm here making amends, Lane said. That's the honest answer. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked across the diner at Cal, and then he looked at Nell. Nell, he said, these men giving you any trouble this morning? Nell set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and looked at the officer with the full weight of 22 years of earned authority. These men, she said, have been here since 9:15. They've patched my ceiling, mopped my floors, and fixed a light in the back booth that has been unreliable since the second Bush administration. I would call that the opposite of trouble. The officer held Nell's gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Lane one more time. Something had shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a withdrawal of the particular kind of attention that feels like pressure. "Carry on," he said. He went back to the counter. Lane released a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. His hands had been unsteady for the last 90 seconds. Cal appeared at his elbow, voice low. "Close." "Not really," Lane said. But his hands were still not entirely steady, and they both knew it. They kept working. The diner moved around them, orders coming in, Nell moving with the fluid efficiency of a woman who knows every inch of her workspace, the ordinary sounds of plates and coffee and conversation. Lane and Cal existed inside all of that as a slightly irregular element that the morning crowd accepted, the way people accept things that have a visible logic to them, even if they don't know the full story. At 11:45, the door opened, and Dax Calloway walked in. He was alone. No Reed, no Briggs, no Vance, no jacket with patches. Just Dax in a plain flannel and jeans and boots, the clothes of any man in his mid-50s, stopping for coffee on a Wednesday morning. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you would not have looked at him twice. Lane knew what he was looking at. He felt the recognition somewhere before his eyes finished registering it. Dax walked to the counter and sat and ordered coffee. He looked at the ceiling, both patches, with a brief professional attention. He looked at the back booth. He looked at Lane. He nodded once. Lane nodded back. Dax drank his coffee. He took his time about it. He was not there to supervise, and he was not there to inspect, and he was not there to be seen being there. Lane understood this immediately and with certainty. He was there because he had implied he would come, and he had come, and for a man like Dax Calloway, that was simply what implied meant. Showing up was not a gesture. It was just the thing you did when you said you would. After about 20 minutes, Nell leaned across the counter and said something to Dax that Lane couldn't hear. Dax listened and said something back, and Nell laughed, a real one, short and direct, the laugh of a woman who has been given back a small piece of something that was taken from her the night before. She looked lighter for a moment, just briefly. Dax put money on the counter and stood. He buttoned the flannel and walked toward the door, and as he passed Lane's position, he said without slowing, without theatrical weight, "Check your phone." He walked out. Lane checked his phone. There was a text from a number. He recognized the number that had called him at 3 in the morning. The text had been sent at 8:47 that morning. It contained a name, Burl Renner, and an address on a county road east of Barstow, and a time 3 o'clock this afternoon. Below the address, a single line. "He runs a crew. Good work. Steady pay. Tell him Dax sent you." Lane read it 3 times. Then he walked to where Cal was finishing the last section of floor near the far wall. Cal looked up. Lane showed him the phone. Cal read it. His jaw tightened slightly, and he blinked twice, and he read it again, and then he handed the phone back. "That's a job," Cal said. His voice was careful, like a man handling something he doesn't want to break by being careless with it. "Looks like a real one," Lane said. Cal straightened up and leaned the mop handle against the wall and stood with his arms at his sides, and his face did a series of things in rapid succession that Lane recognized because he'd felt versions of all of them in the last 12 hours. Disbelief, recalculation, the particular vertigo of a man whose model of how the world operates has just been revised without warning and who hasn't caught up yet with what the revision means. Cal said. "Yeah, why is this happening?" He said it without self-pity, with genuine curiosity, the question of a man who is trying to understand a mechanism he hasn't encountered before. Lane thought about what Dax had said, about rooms where someone makes the choice to help instead of hurt, about what that choice changes in the shape of what comes after. "I think some people," Lane said slowly, "do things not because of what they get from it. I think some people do things because of who they've decided to be. And being that person means doing the thing even when there's no angle in it, even when nobody's watching." Cal thought about this. He looked at the mop handle against the wall, then back at Lane. "I'm coming with you," Cal said, "this afternoon, to see this Burl Renner." Lane looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Cal said. He said it with the same cadence Nell had used the night before, the same rhythm of a person who has moved past the question of obligation into something else entirely. "I know that." I'm coming anyway. They finished the work by 12:30. Every surface clean, ceiling patches dry and solid, back booth light steady, door frame reinforced as well as Lane could manage without proper materials, which turned out to be more solid than it had any right to be given what he had to work with, because Lane knew what he was doing with his hands in a way he'd forgotten for a while and was remembering now. Nell walked the full diner with her eyes moving the way a woman's eyes move when she is assessing whether something has been done right or merely done. She stood at the back booth and pressed the light switch twice. On, off, on. Steady. She looked at Lane. I cannot overstate, she said, how long that light has been a problem. I believe you, Lane said. My brother-in-law has a contracting outfit in Victorville, Nell said. 15 years. Good work, steady clients. He's always looking for reliable people. Lane held up his phone with the text visible on the screen. I already have something, he said. Nell looked at the text. She read it. Something moved across her face. Recognition, and alongside recognition, something more layered and more considered, the expression of a person who knows a name and associates it with things she is not going to say out loud. Burl Renner, she said. You know him. Nell looked at Lane for a moment. I know of him, she said carefully. 15 years in the trades out here. Good reputation. Solid work. She paused. That works. She went to the register. She counted something and came back and held it out. $300 in 50s. Lane looked at it. Then at Nell. Nell, it's not for you, she said. Her voice had the particular firmness of a woman who has made a decision she is not interested in revisiting. It's for Clara. Put it toward the first payment. Call it something good coming out of something bad, which is the best any of us can ask for on the nights that go like last night went. Lane looked at the money. His hand when he took it was not entirely steady. You don't even know her, he said. I know enough, Nell said. I know her brother spent a night making choices for her that almost went irreversibly wrong, and that somewhere in the middle of the worst decision he's ever made, he made a better one. And I want her to know that a stranger from Callaway's Diner on Interstate 40 thought that was worth something. Lane stood there for a moment with $300 in his hand and nothing adequate to say in response to the reason for it. Thank you, he said. The word was insufficient. He said it anyway because it was the only one available. Don't thank me, Nell said for the second time in 12 hours. Just be reliable. She went back to work. Cal was waiting by the door. He'd watched all of this with the careful, full-signal attention he'd been paying to everything since last night. You know what gets me, Cal said as they walked out. What? Last night my biggest fear was getting caught. Cal pushed through the door and held it. Getting caught, getting arrested, losing the ability to keep doing whatever I'd been doing. That was the nightmare scenario. He let the door close behind them and stood in the parking lot in the Wednesday morning sun. And then getting caught turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. Lane thought about that, looked at Cal. That's either very profound, Lane said, or you hit your head harder than we thought. Probably both, Cal said. Lane smiled. It was small and tired, but it was real. They got in the truck. The drive out to the county road address took 40 minutes, the last portion of it, on a road that the truck's suspension registered its objections to in real time. The address led to a construction yard of significant size, 3 active crews working simultaneously on what appeared to be a commercial foundation of considerable scope material, staged with the organized logic of a project that knows what it's doing and has stopped needing to announce it. The man they were looking for was in the middle of everything. Burl Renner was maybe 60, compact, weathered brown by decades of outdoor work, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that appeared to be decorative rather than functional, and a phone in one hand and a rolled set of blueprints in the other. He was giving directions to 2 different people simultaneously with the specific economy of a man who has been doing this long enough that the doing of it has become a form of fluency. No wasted words, no repeated instructions, just the clean, clear delivery of information to the people who need it. He saw them coming when they were still 30 feet away. He ended both conversations at once the way experienced men end things without trailing words and walked toward them. Lane Mercer, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir, Lane said. Burl looked at him the way Dax Calloway had looked at him in the diner. That particular look that isn't judgment, but is reading, taking the measure of something, with the attention of a man who has learned that the measure of things matters, and that rushing the process produces inaccurate results. Dax called me this morning, Burl said. Early, I figured, Lane said. He doesn't call me often. When he does, I listen. He told me you know construction. He told me you're at a turning point. He said you'd show up on time. Burl looked at his watch. You showed up 40 minutes early. I didn't know the roads, Lane said. Burl was quiet for exactly 1 second. Good answer, he said. Bad roads and you're still early. That tells me something. He looked at Cal. His eyes moved over Cal's arm, noting something in the way Cal held it. Who's this, Burl said. Cal Pruitt, Cal said. I'm with him. You do construction. I do whatever needs doing, Cal said. I'm a fast learner. I show up when I say I will. Burl studied him for a moment with the same assessing quality he'd applied to Lane. Then he looked back at Lane. Dax mentioned him. No, sir, Lane said. So he just came. He needed company, Cal said, and I didn't have anywhere better to be. Something shifted in Burl Renner's expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happens in a face just before a smile becomes a possibility. He always liked that, Burl said, looking at Lane. As though they shared a reference Lane was only beginning to understand. Honestly, Lane said, I'm still figuring out what he likes. Burl looked at him for a moment longer. Then he turned and looked at his yard, at the 3 crews and the staged materials and the foundation work in progress with the look of a man running a rapid internal calculation. I'm short 2 men, Burl said. Foundation work this week, framing next. It's physical, and it's early mornings, and it pays honest. If you're here Thursday at 6, you've got a job. Both of you. He looked specifically at Lane. Dax tells me you know plaster and interior wiring. Yes, sir. Then you're not on the foundation crew, Burl said. You're with Martinez on the interior team Thursday. Better rate. Lane felt something move through him that he didn't have an immediate name for. It wasn't relief, because relief was the feeling of a bad thing stopping. This was different. This was the feeling of a door opening in a wall that had been solid for long enough that he'd stopped believing there was a door there. Thursday at 6, Lane said. We'll be here. Burl nodded. He was already turning back toward his yard, already absorbing himself back into the organized motion of the working day. Then he stopped. One thing he said, without turning around. Yeah, Lane said. Whatever you did to get Dax Calloway to call me on a Wednesday morning, Burl said. I don't need the details. I need to know it's behind you. Lane didn't hesitate, not even for a fraction of a second. It's behind me, he said. Burl walked back into his yard and was absorbed by it the way water absorbs things smoothly and completely. And within 30 seconds, he was back on his phone with the blueprints rising in his hand and the machinery of the working day closing around him as if he'd never stepped away. Lane and Cal stood at the edge of the yard. Thursday at 6, Cal said finally. Thursday at 6, Lane confirmed. That's 2 days from now. I can count, Cal. I know you can. Cal was looking out at the yard at the 3 crews at the shape of a foundation rising from nothing. I'm just saying. 2 days ago, I couldn't tell you what Thursday looked like. Couldn't see that far. And now I can. Lane put his hand briefly on Cal's shoulder. Just for a moment. Just enough. Let's go call our families, Lane said. They drove back toward Barstow. The afternoon was clear and the desert on both sides held its distances with the patient indifference it brought to everything. Lane drove with both hands on the wheel and a quality of steadiness in his chest that he recognized after a moment as something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of a man who knows what the next 3 days look like. Not the next 3 years, not the shape of everything that comes after. Just 3 days. Thursday at 6, Clara's payment arrangement, Nell's $300 toward the first installment, small concrete sequential, one thing and then the next thing and then the thing after that. It turned out that was enough. It turned out that was in fact exactly enough. His phone rang at 1:53, the number he recognized. Mr. Wells, Lane said. Mr. Mercer? Garrett Wells's voice was the same as it had been at 3 in the morning. Low, even the voice of a man who speaks at one volume regardless of circumstance. I hear you went to see Burl. Word travels fast, Lane said. Burl texted me when you left, Garrett said. He said, and I'm quoting directly, Dax's guys showed up 40 minutes early. Seems solid, bringing him on Thursday. A pause. I want you to understand what that means. Lane waited. Burl Renner has been in business for 15 years, Garrett said. In 15 years, he has never once hired a man he didn't know personally or hadn't watched work with his own eyes. What Dax's endorsement did, what you showing up early and answering straight did, is something that does not happen on a normal Wednesday. I need you to understand that specifically. I understand it, Lane said. Do you? The question was not rhetorical. It was the genuine question of a man who wants a real answer, because something depends on it. Because what happened last night, and what happened this morning, and what's going to happen Thursday, this is a chain, Mr. Mercer. Each link holds because the one before it held. Dax vouched for you because you put the gun down. Burl hired you because Dax vouched. Every good thing that comes after Thursday happens because Burl gave you a chance. You break one link, the whole chain is worthless. You understand what I'm telling you? Yes, Lane said, completely. Good. A pause. I have a sister, older than me by 4 years. She raised me after our parents died. I was 15, she was 19. She worked 2 jobs for 6 years and never once made me feel like a burden and never once complained where I could hear it. He paused again. When Dax told me you said your sister's name, not my sister, her name Clara, like she was standing in the room with you, I understood exactly what kind of man was in that diner. The kind who still has someone he's fighting for. That kind of man is always worth the risk of a phone call at 3 in the morning. Lane's throat was doing the thing it had been doing intermittently for the last 12 hours. He was becoming resigned to this as apparently a permanent condition of whatever chapter he was now in. Mr. Wells, he said. Don't, Garrett said. Not unkindly. Don't try to thank me. Just build something real with what you've been given today. Make sure Clara knows her brother is the man she always believed he was. That's the whole job. The line went quiet. Cal was watching Lane from the passenger seat. Him again, Cal said. Yeah. What did he say? Lane thought about the chain, about each link and what held it, about a woman 19 years old working 2 jobs and never making a 15-year-old boy feel like a weight. He said, build something, Lane said. Cal sat with that for a moment. The truck covered a mile of desert highway in silence. Okay, Cal said quietly. Okay. Yeah. Then Lane saw them. They came around a long curve in the interstate, and there on the westbound shoulder 4 motorcycles parked in a row. Dax Calloway, Reed Halston, Briggs Maddox, and Vance Pruitt, all standing outside their bikes, helmets in hand, facing east. Facing the road Lane was driving on. Lane's hands tightened on the wheel. Cal started to say something and stopped. Lane eased the truck onto the eastbound shoulder. He put it in park. He got out. The highway noise was immediate and constant truck traffic and wind, the Mojave opening up enormous on all sides, the afternoon sun doing what it did over the desert, which was shine without apology or moderation. Across 40 feet of asphalt and a concrete median, 4 men stood beside 4 motorcycles. Dax raised his hand. Lane raised his. It was not a wave. It was something simpler than a wave and something more than one. It was the gesture of 2 people who have stood in the same room during something real and carry that room with them in the way that certain rooms travel, not as a memory exactly, but as a permanent alteration in the structure of who you are. Vance Pruitt cupped his hands around his mouth. Thursday at 6, he shouted. Across the traffic noise, across the median, across 40 feet of California desert highway. Lane stared at him. How do you know about that? Lane shouted back. Vance grinned. It was the first time Lane had seen him grin, and it was a good one, wide and genuine, and belonging to a man who was considerably warmer than the controlled professional stillness of the night before had suggested. The scar along his jaw moved with it. Burl's been our contractor for 12 years, Vance called back. He texts us when interesting things happen. Cal had gotten out of the truck and was standing beside Lane, and what happened next was not something either of them planned or anticipated or could have explained afterward to anyone's full satisfaction. They started laughing. Both of them at the same moment, the laughter arriving without warning. The way real laughter does not perform, not social, not the polite acknowledgement of something mildly amusing, but the real thing, pressurized and genuine. The release of something that has been compressed for a very long time and has finally found a place to go. They laughed at the grin on Vance Pruitt's face. They laughed at the specific improbability of standing on the shoulder of Interstate 40 outside Barstow, California, at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days removed from the worst decision either of them had ever made, with jobs starting Thursday at 6, and a contractor who texted bikers about interesting things. They laughed at all of it, at the sheer unlikely architecture of how one moment, one choice, one gun set down on a Formica table in the middle of the night could reroute the entire geometry of what came after. Reed Halston across the highway shook his head, but he was smiling. Briggs said something to Dax that made Dax nod once. Dax looked at Lane across the 40 feet and the traffic noise and the concrete median. He didn't shout, he just looked. And in that look without words, Lane received something he understood as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. The particular communication of a man who has passed something on and is now releasing it. The way you release something you've been carrying when you're certain it's going to be carried correctly by whoever has it next. Then Dax put his helmet on. One by one they mounted up. One by one the engine started that sound, that particular deep mechanical voice of those four machines coming to life simultaneously on the shoulder of the highway. A sound that was simultaneously loud and in some quality that Lane could not immediately name profoundly steady. The sound of things built to last being used for the purpose they were built for. They pulled out westbound, into the afternoon, into the Mojave, into the long, straight line of Interstate 40, pointing toward the horizon. Lane watched them until the four sets of taillights were small, and then smaller, and then gone around the long curve of the highway, and the desert took them the way the desert took everything, patiently and completely and without preference. Cal put his hands in his pockets. "You know what I keep thinking about," Cal said. "What?" "Last night, when I walked up to that booth with the Mossberg, when I put the barrel on the table." Cal shook his head slowly. "I thought I was the one holding the power in that moment. I thought I was the one in control of what happened next." He looked at the empty shoulder where the bikes had been, and the whole time they were just waiting. Completely patient, completely calm, just waiting for me to make one more wrong move so they could stop me from finishing what I'd started. "That's not how it felt from where I was standing," Lane said. "No, me neither in the moment. But that's what it was." He paused. "They weren't trying to beat us. They were trying to stop us from destroying ourselves. There's a difference between those two things." Lane thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "There is. They could have hurt us badly," Cal said. "Easily. And they didn't. They could have called the police and walked out. And they didn't do that either. Why didn't they?" Lane looked at the highway where the taillights had been. He thought about Vance and the years he'd referenced the weight he'd carried before someone or something had given him a floor to push off of. He thought about Garrett Wells at 19 and the specific knowledge of what it meant to fight for someone you loved. He thought about Dax pulled over on a highway shoulder in the deep part of the night, thinking about a kid who had said a name like the person it belonged to was standing in the room. "Because they'd been somewhere like where we were," Lane said. "Not the same place, but close enough to recognize it. And someone had done the same thing for them once, or hadn't, and they'd spent years understanding what that absence cost. When you've been that close yourself," Lane said, "you don't see a criminal standing there. You see what's underneath. The person who got to that edge and is standing there not knowing which way to fall." Cal was quiet for a long moment. "Then my dad used to say the only debt worth carrying is the one you pay forward. That anything someone gives you out of genuine grace, you can't pay it back to them directly. You carry it until you find the next person standing at the same edge, and you pay it there." Lane looked at him. "Then we know what we owe," Lane said. "Yeah," Cal said. "We do. They got back in the truck. Lane called Clara. She answered before the first ring completed, which meant she'd been holding her phone, which meant she'd been waiting, which was Clara, which was exactly Clara. "Well," she said, "tell me everything." Lane told her everything. The work at the diner, the ceiling patches, the back booth light that had been a problem for 23 years and had turned out to be a loose ground wire that took 20 minutes and a screwdriver. Nell and $300 and what Nell had said about wanting Clara to know something good had come out of that night. The drive out to Burl Renner's yard on a road the truck didn't appreciate the 40 minutes early Burl's face when Cal said he just came. The phone call from Garrett Wells and the chain each link holding because the one before it held. The highway shoulder and four motorcycles and Vance Pruitt grinning across 40 feet of interstate traffic and shouting Thursday at 6. He told her all of it. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough for Clara that Lane noticed it specifically. She let him get all the way through, and when he was done, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Thursday at 6, she said. "Thursday at 6. And Cal's going. Cal's going." "Okay." A breath that held several things inside it simultaneously. "Okay, Lane, I need you to hear something. I'm listening." "Whatever happens Thursday," Clara said. "And after Thursday, and a year from now, and 10 years from now, I need you to remember that you put a gun down when everything in that room was telling you to hold on to it. When your fear and your exhaustion and everything you'd been carrying for months was telling you to hold on. You put it down anyway. That's not a small thing. Don't let it become a small thing. Lane looked out through the windshield at the highway ahead of them, straight and clear in the afternoon light. Vance told me to, he said. Lots of people tell us things, Clara said. We choose which ones we hear. You heard the right one. Remember that when it gets hard later, because it's going to get hard later. That's just what life does. Remember that you already showed yourself who you are when it counted. Hold on to that, especially on the days when it's hard to believe it. Lane's eyes were doing the thing they'd been doing periodically since 2 in the morning. He was fully reconciled to this apparently being a feature of the new chapter rather than a temporary condition. Clara, he said. Yeah, Nell sent you $300. Silence. A specific kind waited in a way Lane could feel through the phone. She what? From the diner, Lane said. She said she wants you to know that something good came out of last night, that it wasn't only bad. Clara made a sound that was not a word. It occupied the territory adjacent to words, the territory where things go when they're too full to fit inside language. Lane sat with it because some sounds a person makes don't need a response. They just need to be received by someone who understands what they mean. Tell her, Clara said finally when she could. Tell her it already means something. Tell her it already mattered before I even knew about it. I will, Lane said. He hung up. Cal was looking out the passenger window at the highway moving past his face, doing the settled, thoughtful thing it had been doing since morning. You know what we should do, Cal said. What? Wednesday? Tomorrow. Before Thursday. We should go back to Calloway's diner. Sit down. Drink coffee slow. No bandanas, tip Nell well. Just be people who stop at a diner because they want coffee and there's a good one on the road. Lane considered this. That is genuinely a good idea, he said. I have them occasionally, Cal said. More than occasionally now, I think, Lane said. Cal smiled. It was a different smile than the ones Lane was used to seeing on Cal's face. Quieter, less performative, the smile of a man who has stopped selling something and is just sitting with how things actually are. Lane pulled the truck back onto the highway and pointed it toward Barstow. The afternoon was burning clean, and the desert on both sides held its enormous patient silence. The silence of a place that has been here long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything that happens inside it. Somewhere behind them on the westbound, 44 men were riding into the afternoon at a speed that was legal and unhurried, carrying no particular destination and no requirement to be anything other than what they were. Men who had lived long enough and hard enough to understand that the moments that define you are rarely the ones you plan for. They're the ones that find you when you're tired and the coffee has gone cold, and two desperate people walk through a door with weapons they don't fully know how to use, and you make a choice about who you are in the room. Dax Calloway had made that choice at table 14 of Calloway's diner on a Tuesday night. Lane Mercer had made his at the same table 20 minutes later. Neither of them would ever describe it in those terms. That wasn't the vocabulary of either man. But they both carried it, the knowledge of what had been possible and what had been chosen, in the way that consequential things are carried not loudly, not on display, but permanently, like a structural element that doesn't show from any room but holds everything up. Thursday came. Lane Mercer arrived at Burl Renner's construction yard at 5:47 in the morning. The desert was still dark at that hour, the particular pre-dawn dark of the Mojave that has a quality unlike darkness anywhere else. Not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of a place that is simply between one state and another, patient, about the transition, in no hurry to get to the light. The air was cold and smelled of dust and something mineral underneath it. And Lane stood at the gate of the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets and breathed it and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Cal Pruitt was already there. He was standing at the gate with 2 cups of coffee from a gas station down the road, and he extended one toward Lane without a word, because some things had moved past the need for words between them, and the exchanging of coffee at 5:47 in the morning on a Thursday was one of them. They stood in the dark and drank. Burl arrived at 5:59. He came in a truck that had seen significant use and wore it honestly, and he got out and saw them standing at the gate and stopped for a moment. He looked at his watch. He looked at them. Good start, he said. He unlocked the gate. They walked in. The workday began. It was ordinary work. Physical loud, demanding the full attention of the body and leaving the mind to do its processing in the background. Concrete and lumber and the weight of materials and the specific satisfaction of things being built in sequence toward a structure that would stand long after the people who built it were gone. Lane worked with the ease of a man returning to something his hands remembered, even when the rest of him had forgotten it was there. And what he felt doing it was not dramatic and not complicated. It was the feeling of a man in the right place doing the right work on a Thursday morning in February in the Mojave Desert, and it was enough. It was considerably more than enough. At noon, he stepped away and called Nell. "It's Lane," he said. "First day. Wanted you to know." "I know," Nell said. "Burl already texted me." Lane laughed. "Does everyone on this stretch of highway text each other about everything?" "Only about the things that matter," Nell said. A pause. "How is it?" Lane looked out at the yard at Cal, working a section of framing with the focused energy of a man who has decided what his next chapter looks like and is not going to waste a morning getting to it. "It's good," Lane said. "It's really good, Nell." "Yeah," she said simply. "It is." She hung up. Clara got her dialysis that week and the week after and the week after that. The payment arrangement held at numbers that were manageable, not comfortable, not without effort, but manageable, which was the word Garrett Wells had used, and which turned out to be exactly the right word. The precise word, the word that described the difference between a weight that breaks you and a weight you can carry if you choose to carry it with someone instead of alone. The machine kept running. Clara kept living loudly, opinionatedly, with the full force of a woman who has been given back time. She had quietly been afraid she was running out of and intends to use every minute of it. She told Lane what she thought about his eating habits. She told him about the birds, always the birds, new species every week, and her voice on the phone had that quality. It got in the evening softer and more itself, the voice of a person who has decided that the remaining distance is worth traveling. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Cal Pruitt called his mother every Sunday without exception. Not sometimes. Not most Sundays. Every Sunday without fail for reasons that had started as obligation and had become over the weeks and months something that he simply did not want to miss. He was promoted to site lead on a residential project in Apple Valley 6 months after his first day at Burl Renner's yard. Burl, when asked what had made the difference, said only, "You show up, you do the work. You don't make the same mistake twice." That's the whole job description. Cal's mother wrote that sentence on a piece of paper in her best handwriting and put it in a frame and hung it on the wall of her kitchen between a photograph of Cal's father and a small watercolor of a flower where it remained. At Calloway's Diner on Interstate 40, the ceiling was properly repaired 4 weeks after the incident by a man Dax Calloway sent a craftsman named Arturo, who arrived early, worked quietly, charged nothing, and left the ceiling looking better than it had before 2 shotgun blasts had rearranged its plaster. Nell watched him work and said nothing, and when he was done, she shook his hand and thanked him, and he nodded and got in his truck and drove west. Behind the counter near the register, Nell Hargrove kept something she had never kept there before. A note in Lane's handwriting on a piece of Calloway's order paper, 3 lines. "Clara says it already means something. It already mattered before she knew about it. Thank you for making sure something good came out of that night." Nell never threw it away. Some things you keep not because you need to look at them, but because they are proof of something. Proof that on a particular Tuesday night in February on Interstate 40 outside Barstow, California, 2 desperate men walked into a diner and made a choice at the end of it that changed the shape of what came after in ways that spread outward like rings on water touching things, and people that would never know the origin of what had reached them. Dax Calloway and 3 men rode west on the 40 and kept riding the way they always had, steady and unhurried and without ceremony. They stopped for coffee when they wanted coffee and kept moving when they were ready to move, and required no audience for the things they did, which was one of the reasons the things they did had the particular quality they had. And Lane Mercer drove to work in the dark of Thursday morning, and every Thursday morning after that, and he thought sometimes about a Formica table and a revolver, and the specific weight of something set down when everything in him had been saying to hold on. He didn't talk about it much. It wasn't the kind of thing you talked about. It was the kind of thing you carried in the structure of yourself, in the way you showed up, in the way you did the work, in the way you answered a straight question with a straight answer, and the way you picked up the phone when your sister called and said, "Tell me everything." The way you said a name like the person it belonged to was standing right there in the room with you. "Clara," he had said. And everything that had come after the jobs, the payments, the Sunday phone calls, the steady light in the back booth of a diner on the edge of the desert, the mornings at the gate with 2 cups of coffee, and another day of honest work beginning. All of it had grown from that single word said in that particular way to a man who was listening for exactly that. That was the whole story. Everything else was just what happened after, which is to say everything that mattered.